this terrible firebombing of Tokyo in which up to 100,000 Japanese died. These raids were a great quote unquote success in the eyes of LeMay. In McNamara's mind, they were a stain on his record because he later quoted something that LeMay actually said to him, which was, if we had lost the war, we would have been condemned as war criminals. And the assumption that McNamara had was that this would have been an accurate description of what they did. They were war criminals.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. It is March of 1945. Guam, the Northern Marianas, the centerpiece of the U.S. effort to win the war in the Pacific. The bombing has been going on of Japan for some time, but ineffectively. So much so that the new commander of the B-29s, Curtis LeMay, moves them from India to Guam, to Saipan, to Tinian, the Northern Marianas. They fly a long distance, drop their bombs, and come back. But they've been ineffective. The war is not going well in the Pacific to end it. And what is to be done? I welcome William Taubman, who with his brother Philip Taubman, the authors of a new book, McNamara at War, A New History. The clue here is that Robert McNamara is on Guam Island as a trusted assistant to Curtis LeMay. Why? Bill, a very good evening to you. Thank you for joining me, Professor. This incident gains little attention from Mr. McNamara's autobiographies and his remarks afterwards. You highlight that in your book, that he had at one point just one line to say, I also served in the Pacific. What is critical here is to understand is that Curtis LeMay, by himself, but with his assistants, including Robert McNamara, came up with an effective way to destroy the Japanese ability to resist, called the firebombing of the Japanese cities, especially Tokyo, March 9th, 1945. What was Robert McNamara's part in that? What was his job? Why was he in the Pacific at that moment? Good evening to you, Professor.
Good evening to you. McNamara's role in World War II was as a kind of statistician. He was working for the Army Air Corps, and he was keeping track of how many planes there were and how many sorties they flew and how many targets they destroyed and how many pilots they lost and all sorts of logistical questions like that. And on Guam, he was advising LeMay to the effect that the bombers were flying too high, and that accounted for their missing targets and botching their missions. And he, not alone, and maybe not even as the main advisor to LeMay, made the case that the planes should fly in much lower at, say, 4,000 feet instead of 20,000 feet. The better to see the targets and hit the targets and carry out their mission. So that's what happened. McNamara didn't fly the planes. He didn't give the orders. That was LeMay who gave the orders and actually flew in the first plane and produced this terrible firebombing of Tokyo in which up to 100,000 Japanese died. I must add that this way of doing it was not popular with the pilots because they were exposed at a lower altitude to the anti-aircraft fire and thus vastly increasing their risk of being shot down. And some of them, many of them, I think, actually never reached the target because they claimed that there was some kind of mechanical difficulty on the plane, so they had to turn back. But the reason that many of them turned back was to avoid being killed in these raids. Anyway, the raids were carried out. McNamara admired LeMay's toughness in making this choice. And although these raids were a great quote unquote success in the eyes of LeMay, in McNamara's mind, they were a stain on his record because he later quoted something that LeMay actually said to him, which was, if we had lost the war, we would have been condemned as war criminals. And the assumption that McNamara had was that this this would have been an accurate description of what they did. They were war criminals.
It's important to look at the relationship between McNamara and LeMay because you see it reproduced again with Kennedy and again with Johnson. McNamara's understanding that he is an assisting a commander, a strong mind, and that he must do everything he can for that commander, for that boss. Same at the Ford Company. That's a part of his personality, I'm presuming, came from somewhere in his education or his childhood to find a strong man and be loyal to him. Is that correct, Bill?
Yes, there were several of these strong men to whom he gave his service. One of them was LeMay. A second one was Henry Ford II, who
Hmm.
made McNamara eventually president of the Ford Motor Company. He worked there after the war from 45 to 1961. When a third such man appeared in his life, that was John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, uh, whom he viewed rather differently, I think. He thought of Kennedy as particularly bright and intelligent and experienced and open to objections from a man like McNamara working for him. The next man was Lyndon Johnson, who was a different kind of president, who did not want to hear uh, no, or didn't want to hear objections to what he, Johnson, wanted to do. And that led to a lot of difficulty for McNamara and for Johnson in ways that I will eventually try to describe.
Forgive me, it's the reader of Shakespeare and reader of the Oedipal Rex story that asks this next question. Born
Yes.
1916 in Oakland, California, his father was older. How much older than his mother? And did that influence McNamara in any of his autobiographical writings?
Well, McNamara's father was about 24 years older, I think, than his mother. But what Phil, my brother, and I, writing the book, paid attention to was the character of his parents. His father was cold, aloof, distant, dry, uh, and in a way that led, not in a mechanistic fashion, to McNamara's cold side. McNamara was once described by Senator Barry Goldwater as a computer with legs. Many people described McNamara as cold and arrogant, and I think some of this came from observing his father. His mother, in contrast, was passionate, uh, deeply devoted to her son, worshipful in a way of her son's brilliance and of his success, but driving him to excel. He would come home with an A or an A minus from school, and his mother would chide him for not getting an A plus. She drove him to excel, pushing him, pushing him. She wrote him letters, which we discovered in the archive of McNamara's widow. She wrote him letters at Harvard Business School and during the war. And these letters are remarkable because, on the one hand, they treat him as a kind of possessor of a divine gift. She keeps praising him for his brilliance. But on the other hand, they're full of what amounts to petty tutelage, reminding him as if he is still in grade school to wear his overcoat because it's cold in Cambridge, practically reminding him to brush his teeth. Uh, this kind of petty tutelage, which I think had the effect of infantilizing him. So, this strange combination of worshiping her magnificent son on the one hand and treating him as if he needs to be reminded to brush his teeth on the other.
He goes to the University of California at Berkeley. I believe, is that the Golden Bears? I'm not sure. I think it is.
Yes. Yes.
And does not go to Stanford. Good for him. Good choice. And he gets an excellent education and he's very successful. And then he makes a decision to go to the Harvard Business School that was brand new. There was very little attention to business being turned into a PhD or something you study. Why did he choose HBS?
Well, first of all, I want to just say that at Berkeley, he was one of three students in a class of 3,000 who were initiated into Phi Beta Kappa in his junior year. So he was brilliant. He goes to Harvard Business School, having been turned down, I should say, for a Rhodes Scholarship. He picks Harvard because it's Harvard, but also because he has the sense that he's majored in economics at Berkeley and is a whiz at mathematics, and he thinks that business may be what he wants to do. But he has a broad view of business. He wants to combine, as he emphasizes over and over again, he wants to combine uh, sort of the service to a particular firm or entity with service to the world, to the nation and the world. That's his idea, that it's a big mistake for a businessman to focus entirely on profits. A businessman who is open to the world and in service to the world is the kind of man he wants to be. And at Harvard Business School, he turns out to be number one in his class. So he's the smartest guy at Harvard Business School, as well as as he was at Berkeley.
Statistical control is what they called it. In other words, numbers guy. His father dies November 1938, his second year at Harvard, I believe. He didn't attend the funeral. Why not?
Well, his mother wanted him to come, but didn't want to disturb his education. So she told him not to come. It was too far, it was too complicated. McNamara, we suspect, although this is speculation, was not wild about his father. I don't think he had a kind of sentimental attachment to his father that would have driven him to come home under any circumstances and violating his mother's injunction.
The romance includes a trip in Europe that is quite extraordinary. I wonder if he left notes about it. With pals, they traveled through all the European countries that were about to be torn in pieces by the war. I believe this is the summer of 39. Is that
Yes,
correct?
it is.
That's
He's there actually in September 39, right on the eve of the Nazi invasion of Poland.
and he's there. He travels through Berlin. He travels through France. And what does he leave notes behind? A revelation to him about what he was seeing as the continent contracted into catastrophe.
Well, his recollections include the kinds of everyday things that tourists do, going
Mm.
to see this church or that avenue or that museum. And he admits, which is really quite stunning, that he was not aware that war was in the offing. He was in Berlin in September 1939. He actually heard Hitler speak, but he admits that he didn't realize that war was right around the corner, which is a hell of an admission for a guy who's going to become the marshal in charge of American forces and the war in Vietnam.
It's consistent with your theme of McNamara at war. Romance also includes young women. He was in love with a woman who was tormented by what appears to be an incurable arthritis, and she rejected his advances, protecting herself and protecting their marriage. And then he meets Margie or Marjorie. Who is she?
Margie is a woman who's been a fellow student at Berkeley. She, I think, combines majors in one of the traditional disciplines with physical education. She later teaches physical education along with a more traditional subject in high school. So, in a sense, she is really not McNamara's match as an intellect, but she's a lovely woman, and she is a upbeat woman. She is an amusing woman. She is a cheerful woman, and as McNamara later says, she complimented L.E. McNamara in all these ways because he did not view himself as a happy, cheerful a woman. And he says she provided him with what he lacked, what his personality lacked. And that was true of their entire life. And he loved her partly for that.
HBS, he becomes a teacher. Marjorie's with him. I believe they have their daughter. And on December 7th, 1941, they hear of the attack in Pearl Harbor. What was McNamara's first response?
They rushed next door to see their neighbors and to talk about where this would lead. What kind of war would this be? What would his role be? And he wanted very much to take part in this war. And the war came to him at Harvard. He was an instructor there, and he was teaching away. And a man named Tex Thornton, who was at the Pentagon, came up from Washington to try to set up a school for officers at Harvard in which they would learn statistical control. And McNamara was one of the first to agree to do this. And Tex Thornton almost immediately recommended or realized that McNamara was the pick of the litter at Harvard. He was the smartest guy around. He was the one who would fit perfectly into Thornton's mission of attracting brilliant Harvard professors to teach statistical control to American officers. And that's what he did.
And at that moment, was he spotted by Lovett then, or was it later when he was in Washington?
I'm sorry, didn't catch that.
When he was spotted by Robert Lovett, was it when Tex chose him or when he went to Washington?
Yes, Robert Levitt, who later became Secretary of Defense, but I was not yet doing that, was the one who had sent Tex Thornton to Harvard. And Lovett, like Thornton, immediately noticed that McNamara was the smartest of the people that they had found and were designated to teach American officers.
Lovett's a fascinating character because he's blue blood and he chooses McNamara. And I have to believe that's the connection that comes in 1960 because Kennedy didn't know Ford before that. So there had to be a connection there. It's a nice detail, Bill. Very nice detail.
Yes,
But we're at war now, and we've already said Guam in 45. McNamara served honorably in Europe during the period of heavy bombing by the U.S. the 8th Air Force and the British equivalent. However, Robert McNamara is now in the war. He serves honorably. Statistical control. It's important to identify that in 21st century terms. If I understand it, Bill, there was no sense in the military before this to keep records of parts, supply chains, readiness, engines, morale, all of that together. Is that correct?
yes, that was certainly true of the Army Air Corps, whose commanding general, I think his name was Hap Arnold, wanted all of those things and set out to recruit people who would provide them, including McNamara.
The job was to keep the planes flying and to avoid the fact that they had an appalling destruction percentage. What was it, 4%? 4% per flight.
I think so, yes.
However, McNamara's job was to keep the planes flying, and he was very good at it. And he trained other people, and he had partners through, chiefly out of Britain, because that's where the planes were launching from. And that counting turned into an advantage everywhere. The war is over, and he's recruited by a man who sees that Ford Motor Company is falling well behind General Motors because they don't know statistical control, nor do they pay attention to the fact that they're losing money. Ford is 150,000 people, and they're losing money. And Henry Ford, the second, his brother, there's Henry Ford, the original. There's Edsel, who dies, and Henry Ford II is not trained to manage a business at this scale, a business that's losing money. And so he chooses a team to come in and help him. And that team is guided and becomes the whiz kids of Ford. Again, McNamara is chosen by his talents out of a large group of people. Who chooses McNamara to go to Ford? Whose idea is that?
Well, it's Tex Thornton, who had recruited McNamara to join the war effort as a statistical controller. And Tex Thornton puts together this team of 10 military specialists from the war and goes up to Detroit and sells them, offers them to Ford. And Ford realizes he needs them, and so he picks them. And it turns out that McNamara is the brightest guy, and we read uh, interviews with recollections of people who worked with Ford and worked with McNamara, and they recognize that McNamara is the brightest of all of them. And so he begins his rise at the Ford Motor Company.
It's important to note that he had good relations with everybody, although there was resentment because of the swiftness of his rise. They were called the Whiz Kids. I learned from Bill and Phil that there was a popular radio show called the Quiz Kids, so it just rhymes. That's where Whiz Kids come from. And he introduced safety, the seat belts. He introduced the idea of a cheaper car, a more economical car. He had ideas that we now take for granted that were not obvious at the time. 15 years he spends at Ford, and he chose not to live inside the Ford ranch. In fact, they chose to live in Ann Arbor. Why?
Well, that's very interesting because he and his wife had adored living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, when he was at Harvard Business School. And in fact, they described their years there as the happiest years of their lives. So he gets to Ford, and everybody else in the group wants to live in Grosse Pointe,
Right.
near Ford, with near General Motors executives. But McNamara chooses to live in Ann Arbor. And in a way, he's attempting to recreate the experience he had in Cambridge, surrounded by a university, this time the University of Michigan, socializing with professors, specialists, economists, statisticians, physicists, humanists. He chooses to live there, even though it makes him look like a bit of an outlier at the Ford Motor Company. In fact, he describes the stress that he experiences, well, throughout his life, but at Ford because he's chosen not to live with all the other Ford executives. And he likes his life there. Um, uh, I mean, it's different. And he's viewed as different, but he's also viewed as brilliant. So, despite his choosing to live in Ann Arbor, he rises through the ranks to the top of president of the Ford Motor Company.
It is 1960, after the election. John Kennedy's been elected, putting a cabinet together, and Robert McNamara gets a phone call one morning at his office at Ford. Who calls him and what did he want?
Well, the person who calls him is Bobby Kennedy. And Bobby, that is the president's brother, RFK. And he wants McNamara to talk to Sergeant Shriver, who is President Kennedy's, what was he, cousin or brother-in-law? I guess brother-in-law. And what Sergeant Shriver wants to do is to come up to Detroit and talk to McNamara about becoming the first thing he offers is Secretary of the Treasury. But McNamara says, "My God, I'm not qualified for that." So Sergeant Shriver says, "Well, then, how about Secretary of Defense?" And McNamara again says, I'm not qualified for that. But Sergeant Shriver says, "Well, why don't you come down to Washington and talk to President-elect Kennedy? Because he wants you to take either one of these jobs." And McNamara eventually makes it to Washington, but only after trying to avoid the trip.
He's reluctant. He doesn't want the job. He doesn't know Kennedy. He doesn't want the job. Is that correct, Bill?
Right. That's right. Very interesting because it's a moment of modesty in the life of a man who is increasingly immodest about his achievements and his position in the government.
The machinations here require McNamara to attempt to, the polite word is fib to the Kennedys. Is that how you chose to make this explanation? He fibbed to get out of it and it didn't work.
Yes, he tries to get out of it by saying there's bad weather. I can't come when Kennedy wants me to come. But eventually he feels he has to respond to a president who has asked him in particular for an interview, as it were. So he does go to Washington. And in the first, he meets with Kennedy, and he is not eager to take the job. In fact, he resists taking the job. In fact, when he finally agrees to take the job, he imposes, which is an odd word to use when you're meeting with the President of the United States, he imposes conditions. The first condition is he wants to be free to choose his aides based on their merit, based on their talent, rather than their political careers. And the second condition is he wants not to be what he calls a socializing Secretary of Defense. That is a guy who spends all his time at parties and cocktail hours. He wants to be a working Secretary of Defense. But Kennedy surprises him by accepting both conditions, or at least seeming to. Later, Kennedy admits to McNamara that he threw a letter that McNamara brought with him to Washington containing these conditions. Kennedy says, I threw them in the wastebasket. And so McNamara accepts the job, not knowing that Kennedy threw them in the wastebasket. And Kennedy says, fine, let's go out on the steps of his Georgetown house. And he introduces McNamara as his new Secretary of Defense.
61, 62. 61 is the Bay of Pigs fiasco. 62 is the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is as high a pressure as it gets, apocalyptic pressure. McNamara gets through both instances and forms what you'd have to say is band of brothers with the Kennedys through these instances, and he's not blamed or faulted. JFK is extremely generous towards him. What do we know that the president thought of McNamara? What was his opinion?
The president admired McNamara and actually began to regard him as the star of his cabinet. And we found out, I don't know whether this was known before, but we found out that Kennedy and his brother Bobby not only admired the way McNamara was conducting his job as Secretary of Defense, but they considered replacing Johnson in 1964, assuming that Kennedy would live and run again, with McNamara as vice presidential candidate. And not only that, when they talked about 1968, presuming that Kennedy would be reelected in 1964, they talked of arranging for McNamara to be the Democratic Party's presidential candidate in 1968. They thought he was such a wonderful man, such a talented man, such a brilliant man that they wanted in 1968 to put the fate of the country in his hands.
1:55 p.m. East Coast time, November 22nd. McNamara's in a meeting with McGeorge Bundy and others, and he's interrupted for a moment by someone who brings him news that the CIA says the president's been shot and is dead. That is not confirmed by anyone else, although the meeting breaks up immediately. Soon after, it's confirmed. McNamara's first thoughts, Bill.
McNamara's first thoughts is what the hell is going to happen? And he actually is summoned to Andrews Air Force Base, where the president's plane has brought his body back to Washington from Dallas, and where Jacqueline Kennedy, with a blood-stained pink dress, has observed Lyndon Johnson take the oath of office even before the plane left Dallas. So McNamara is out there, and Bobby says, "Let's go in. Let's go into the plane and greet them." And McNamara is smart enough to say, "No, you go yourself. I'm not close enough to Jackie." But Jackie wants his presence, and after a visit home briefly, she summons him to Bethesda Naval Hospital, where she spends the whole night sitting on a chair, recounting and recounting again the terrible day that has just passed in which her husband has been shot and killed. And McNamara is sitting at her feet, on the floor in front of the chair where she's recounting this, and listening to her the whole night, um, and realizing that she wants him present in her life, which is what he becomes. And he begins to have a kind of double life. On the one hand, he is Johnson's manager of the Vietnam War. On the other hand, he is a secret opponent of the Vietnam War in his own mind. And he talks about this in his relationship with Jackie Kennedy. Both of these stories are worth telling. We tell them in great detail in the book. The one that I know more about is his relationship with Johnson. And if you'd like, John, I can talk about that because I think it was a combination of two complicated psychological characters feeding off each other, that is, Johnson and McNamara, in a way that in the end does them no service.
Yes, let's begin with the very first moment then. On the ride in the helicopter from Andrews Air Force Base to the White House after the landing of the coffin, Johnson asked McNamara and I believe others to accompany him in the helicopter ride. And he tells them right then he wants them to stay on in the cabinet. Do I have that correct, Bill?
Yes, that's correct.
So Johnson makes a decision without consulting, just, you're going to do this. You're not leaving me. I need you. Why at that moment did McNamara think Johnson had told him? He hardly knows. He doesn't know the vice president. And in fact, you have lots of information, anecdotes, that the vice president was frozen out of the Kennedy circle, never invited to their parties, never seen as somebody to trust, had no part in the Cuban Missile Crisis, was not understood as anything but, what do you call him? They called him Rufus Cornpone. So at this moment, Rufus Cornpone is the president of the United States, and he asked McNamara to stay on. Why? What did Johnson see in McNamara?
Well, Johnson saw pretty much what Kennedy had seen: a brilliant man, an ultra efficient man, a seemingly super self confident man. And Johnson needed all of these things just because he had not been a part of the inner circle of Kennedy. And one thing we discovered was that not only McNamara, but Bundy and the others at their first meeting with Johnson to talk about the Vietnam War, they get the sense, they use the phrase, Johnson reveals a quote, tone for action. This is very important because Johnson himself, we learn, is not sure at all about Vietnam. There's this incredible conversation that he has with Senator Richard Russell of Georgia, in which Johnson says things like, Vietnam is a mess. I don't know what the hell to do about this mess. But he has a sense that he's got to do something. There's tone for action. Now, McNamara has also a divided mind about Vietnam, witness his willingness to urge Kennedy to pull out. But he wants to please the boss, Johnson. And so what McNamara does is he takes Johnson's tone for action, and in typical McNamara fashion, he makes the case for action in Vietnam. As he's always been this brilliant man who makes the case and wants to please his boss. He does it again, and that leads Johnson to firm up his decision to fight the war and try to win the war. And when he does that, it inspires McNamara to make the case even more brilliantly. So we have this situation where McNamara is taking his cue from Johnson to make the case for the war, and that is increasing Johnson's certainty that is what he should do. So they each build on each other, and there's a kind of circle in which each one strengthens the other one's sense that the war must be fought and, if possible, won.
In that helicopter ride, George Bundy and George Ball are there, Under Secretary of State. In other words, present is the hawk, the mixed opinion, and the peacenik. They're all there. McGeorge Bundy will come over. He's National Security Advisor. He'll come over exhausted to the side of McNamara, but not in that helicopter ride. Ball did not speak up, I'm presuming, at that point, or his position was not thorough. But Ball is noted again and again as the man who said, this is a bad idea, don't make it worse. And Johnson had them all in front of him. Do I say that correctly, Bill?
Yes, Johnson made Ball into a kind of house devil's advocate
Right.
with a permission to oppose the war. But even when Ball did that, Johnson, having encouraged him to speak, ignored it. And a very interesting pattern developed between Ball and McNamara. When there was to be a decisive meeting at the White House to decide whether to escalate the war, McNamara would stop by Ball's office on the way over and seemed to agree with Ball that the war should not be escalated. But when they got to the White House and Johnson asked McNamara's opinion, he turned out to be the fiercest exponent, fiercest advocate of escalating the war, much to Ball's disappointment and shock.
Professor William Taubman, Bill Taubman, of Amherst College, with his brother Philip Taubman, have published a new book about McNamara at war. It's revelatory, however, of the whole of the catastrophe of Vietnam. In addition, it tells us a deal about the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration that this poor reader has never seen before, and I believe there's information here that no one's seen before about the relationship of the cognoscenti, the elite of the Kennedy years and the Johnson years, which tend to have overlaps. We begin, however, with the man at the center now, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who never expected to be president. He was morose as vice president because his job, he thought in his life, was to be number one. He's born to a man named Sam and a mother named Rebecca. That relationship, Rebecca and Sam, are something that is inside Lyndon Baines Johnson, so he recognizes the astute learning as a good thing. His mother had that. And he also recognizes people who push hard. His father had that. But something happened on the way to the rich house. They wound up in a poor house. Why, Bill? Continuing the story of McNamara, we have to explore Lyndon Johnson. Why did the Johnson family lose its money? How did it happen? What did it do to Lyndon?
Well, Rebecca Johnson, Johnson's mother, wanted her husband to be a star, and for a while he was in the Texas legislature. But then he failed and found himself viewed as a kind of joke, a man who had big dreams and failed to achieve them. Meanwhile, Rebecca Johnson, Lyndon Johnson's mother, shifted her idolization from her husband to her son. She idolized Lyndon Johnson. She wanted him to be the star that her husband had been once and then failed to be. Now, how this impacted Johnson is something for psychiatrists to say in any detail. But what I noticed about this was that Johnson, whom I think of as a kind of manic man, a manic politician who is trying to become a leader, trying to become a great success, striving to convince anybody he meets that he's a wonderful man who deserves to be a success, that this man had periods of depression. In fact, periodically, he would fall into bed, cover himself with his blankets and his pillow, and stay there until his dear wife, Lady Bird, convinced him to get up and get back into the game. And I hesitate to try to explain these periods of depression. All I know is that they were there, and I think they were related to moments in his life when it looked as if his hopes and dreams would never be achieved. Now, this is important because it seems to me that for a man like Johnson, who was probably bipolar and unsure of himself at this level, a man like McNamara appears to be the answer. McNamara, as I said before, ultra efficient, seemingly self-confident, able to make the case for what Johnson wants more brilliantly than Johnson himself. And so McNamara becomes somebody whom Johnson wants by his side in the White House. And he almost seems to worship McNamara. We have all kinds of examples of how he flatters McNamara. McNamara, for example, would be at home with his family preparing a barbecue lunch on a weekend, on a Sunday, and the phone would ring, and it would be Johnson saying, "Put down your hamburgers and come on over to the White House. I want to talk to you." And so the McNamara family would drop everything and go over to the White House. And Johnson would, as I say, command his presence, take him swimming in the White House pool, probably naked as Johnson was swimming in the White House pool. And he would demand that McNamara be at his service, both in Vietnam and in other things, not just Secretary of Defense matters, but other matters like the supersonic civilian airliner. Johnson put him in charge of that. McNamara was to be at his beck and call, both in Vietnam and on all sorts of other matters. And Johnson, too, wanted to make McNamara his vice president. He thought of replacing Humphrey as his choice with McNamara. So McNamara was his fair-haired boy and his errand boy.
The re-election first. And we come to Johnson's doubts about the re-election, Johnson's concerns that the Kennedys will ambush him and Robert Kennedy will come forward and make his candidacy and challenge the vice president. Two things happen, but I want to attend at the Tonkin Gulf first. It's early August 1964. There is a black operation run against the North Vietnamese by the South Vietnamese. And there is an escort, U.S. Navy escort for the black operations. There is gunfire, shooting back, and this is reported to the president. I believe within 48 hours or 24 hours, there's said to be a second incident. With the story is, the narrative is, the North Vietnamese have fired at a U.S. Navy destroyer, a second one. There were two destroyers. Johnson and McNamara knew the facts and didn't convey them with candor to the U.S. Congress, and that was successful in winning the Tonkin Gulf resolution. McNamara has written about this and talked about it over the years. What is McNamara's opinion of how they did that, why they did that, and what does McNamara feel regrets for that?
Well, it would appear that the first attack was a real attack.
Yes.
But it would also appear that it was, as you said, John, in response to actions by the South Vietnamese, prompted by the Americans, bombing North Vietnamese installations on the coast of Vietnam. So, in that sense, the story was not as it was presented to the Congress. It was presented to the Congress as an unprovoked attack. Another element that had turned out later, McNamara did not know this at the time, but found out only later, was that although it occurred when George Bundy was in Vietnam, that the Vietnamese people who launched the attack on the first destroyer did not know that. The assumption was in the White House, shared by McNamara, that the attack was a deliberate provocation by the Vietnamese who knew that George Bundy was in Vietnam. So that's a second diversion from the actual truth of the matter. The third untruth that is assumed in the White House is that there was indeed a second Vietnamese attack on a second American destroyer. But it appears that was in the imagination of the sonar guys on the destroyer. There was no such attack, a second attack. So all of this was presented to the Congress. The Congress voted, and I'm not sure, but I think they voted unanimously for the Tonkin Gulf resolution.
It was near two unanimous. I think there was some dissent, but yet near
Maybe
two
it
is
was
mine.
George Aitken of Vermont, yes, Senator Aitken. But at any rate, this resolution provided a kind of substitute for a declaration of war.
Right.
Provided the basis for the Americans to use force from then on in Vietnam.
The second incident we will turn to because it has to do with the convention at Atlantic City and Lyndon Johnson's concerns that Bobby Kennedy would rise up and challenge his candidacy, and that he would use a speech by Jackie Kennedy to launch the Kennedy campaign for 64. Lyndon Johnson wants to be elected president of the United States. He wants the endorsement of the American people because he's inherited the job with the tragedy of JFK. But on the eve of his nomination process in Convention Hall in Atlantic City, in the heat of the summer, he hears a story that Jackie Kennedy is going to come out for Bobby Kennedy and nominate or urge his nomination for president. That does not happen, but there is reason to believe, in fact, it's in the voice of McNamara telling the president, that McNamara will spend the evening, the night, with Jackie Kennedy before that event could happen. And he will carry to the president the information that he wants to know. Will Jackie Kennedy do this or not? A shorthand version is that McNamara, to win the favor of the president who's anxious and insecure and actually sure that he's going to be humiliated by the Kennedys again, he uses McNamara to spy on the Kennedys, and McNamara goes along with it. And it's not the only time he does it. Have I said that generally correctly, Bill?
Yes, you have, although I think I would alter slightly the notion of McNamara's motivation, because by the time this happens, I think McNamara is already clearly Johnson's fair-haired boy. I don't, I'm not at all sure. This would be speculation. I'm not at all sure that he needs to do this spying on the Kennedys to ensure his future in the Johnson White House. But he does do it, and he does it quickly and willingly and effectively. And he does it for all those reasons because he has already become a kind of favorite of Jacqueline Kennedy and a friend of Bobby Kennedy. So he has an intro into their lives. He does indeed fly up to Rhode Island to spend a weekend at the home of Jacqueline Kennedy's mother, where Jackie herself is present. He is indeed close to Bobby Kennedy, and later on, when Bobby Kennedy makes a run for president in 1968, McNamara endorses him in effect at a time when McNamara, has already become president of the World Bank and is not supposed to be endorsing any candidates in American politics. So he's close to both Bobby and to Jackie, and he undertakes to check on their attitude toward the presidential election in 64. And he comes back to reassure Johnson that Jackie is not going to do what Johnson fears she's going to do. And he also comes back to a report, and on this particular trip or later, that Bobby Kennedy has decided to aim for the Senate and to run for senator in New York rather than president, which much reassures Johnson, but probably discombobulates McNamara, because I don't think McNamara was the kind of guy. He was a straight arrow. He was a Boy Scout. I don't think he liked the idea of reporting back to Johnson on the inner feelings or political plans of Bobby and of Jackie.
The word you and Philip use for the relationship between McNamara and the First Lady is opaque. And that's very well said, because the information here is suggestive but opaque. They have had a affection for each other since they danced a twist together in parties in 1961 and 62 in Georgetown.
Yes.
McNamara's a good dancer, and Jackie enjoys his company. But after the president's death, you have many anecdotes and you take it from letters that Jackie wrote to Robert McNamara, that she depends upon his strength a great deal over time. And you repeatedly report when Marjorie goes out of town on business because she becomes a very prominent person in terms of having children read books, that he would spend the night or the evening, it's left unclear, with Jackie Kennedy. They, in a romantic terms, they were very good friends. Is that fair, Bill?
Well, I think we even use the term loving, she developed a kind of love for him and he for her. We do not speculate about how this was consummated or whether it was consummated, but it was quite clear that he not only admired her as a intelligent, sophisticated, beautiful woman, but that he wanted to help her, especially after her husband was so brutally murdered. One of the things he said early on, which shocked us, was he offered to buy her a house or to
Right.
buy her the house in which she had lived before she and John Kennedy moved into the White House. And she talked to him in her letters to him uh, by saying she wanted him to be a model for John Kennedy Jr. She wanted him to be the kind of father figure for John, little John, that his father never had a chance to become.
But the war was always there. The night of the incident where she pounded on McNamara's chest, when was that?
Well, he goes up to New York, and very interestingly, he goes up without a security detail. And he gets on a bus to her apartment on Fifth Avenue. He's staying down by the river, East River. And he gets jostled on the bus, and somebody picks his pocket. So when he gets to the restaurant he wants to take her out to, he has to beg money from the president of the World Bank, whom he notices there. But this is all sort of by the by, because as they spend the evening together at her apartment on Fifth Avenue, sitting on the sofa, she gets so agitated about the war and so convinced that only he can can end it that she begins to pound on his chest, saying, "End the bomb! You must end the slaughter! End the slaughter!" She has decided, quite rightly, that he wants to end the war. Uh, and she thinks he might be able to do so, and she hopes and prays that he will.
It is 1965. Lyndon Johnson has been successful in domestic policy to a degree that it must be protected. His successes of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and other legislation that we now call the Great Society. However, the Vietnam War puts all of it at risk. It puts him in a position where he believes that he must be successful in everything to maintain his advantages in the Congress, to maintain his domestic policy. That's the tango from the president's side. Bill, the tango from the McNamara's side is that increasingly, with his control of data, he sees that the war is not going to be easily resolved. He sees that, and he tells that to his companions, his colleagues. He does not tell it to the media or to the American people. Do we know why he held back and was not candid? He was certainly candid about the missile gap when he first became Secretary of the Treasury. He was certainly candid, a truth teller in meetings in which he upset the general staff, the admirals. He disappointed everybody in the building because he would speak candidly. Why did he hold back about telling the public about how the South Vietnamese government was rotten? Just that, as opposed to talking about the battlefield, talk about the bad management that we're protecting.
Before I tell you why I think he didn't speak that in public or to President Johnson, let me point to the moment that proved to us that he secretly opposed the war. We know first that in the spring and summer of 1965, he was the fiercest proponent of escalating the war and turning it from a South Vietnamese war into an American war. We know that because we have his arguments. We have the testimony of others saying he was the most extreme proponent of the war. But how do we know that he was a secret opponent of the war? Well, we have the secret diary of McNamara's most important aide at the Pentagon, a man named John McNaughton, who he later was going to appoint as Secretary of the Navy. And in this diary, McNaughton reports what McNamara says to him in private. And the line that is clinching comes in April 1966 when he says to McNaughton, I want so badly to bring the boys home from Vietnam that I can hardly stand it. He wants so hard, so badly to bring them home that he can hardly stand it. But he does not speak this truth either to the public, of course, or to Lyndon Johnson. Why not? Because he still believes in helping Lyndon Johnson as a man he admires, even less about Vietnam, but more for his domestic record, as you mentioned, launching the war on poverty, backing the Civil Rights Act, backing the Voting Rights Act. He wants to support Johnson in that work with which he agrees deeply. There are other reasons he doesn't want it to go public with it. Um, and he doesn't go public for the next 2 years. He doesn't leave the office until 68. Why? Well, he wants to be loyal not only to Johnson, but to the presidency. His notion of his job is to be loyal to the president and the presidency. And when he's interviewed later and asked why he is silent, he says he doesn't say what his oath of office had required of him, which is that he support and defend the Constitution. No, it's the president and the presidency and Lyndon Johnson in particular. I think that is the main reason, this sense of his loyalty to the president.
November 1966. The Secretary of Defense is invited to Harvard College to speak to faculty and students at the behest of Henry Kissinger, a professor at Harvard College. He arrives at Harvard and he's being driven into the yard, and the car is surrounded. It reminded me of Venezuela and Richard Nixon in the 1950s. Pounding on the car, McNamara gets out of the car and gets on the hood or the roof. He gets on the hood to address the students. That's not the first instance he's known of protest against the Vietnam War, but it's certainly a vivid scene. What did he make of it afterwards? What did that represent to him?
Well, he gets up on the car and he says to these anti-war students, when I was at Berkeley and I was protesting in demonstrations, I was more I was tougher than you are, and I was more civil than you are, which was not exactly what you want to say to a mob of anti-war students who are pounding on the car. Well, the Secret Service and the Harvard police save McNamara. They usher him into the steam tunnels underground in Harvard, and they let him out near this meeting with Harvard professors. And at this meeting with Harvard professors, McNamara reveals the other side of himself as a secret opponent of the war. And I think it's on this occasion that Graham Allison, who later becomes the dean of the Kennedy School and an assistant secretary of defense, takes notes. He's a graduate student at this point. And in his notes, he says, I can't believe what we are seeing and hearing, that McNamara, this warrior, doesn't want the war to continue. And he is a sort of secret opponent of the war. And as I say, Allison can't believe what he's hearing. Now, John, what your question was?
About McNamara's opinion of seeing the student protest. He made that speech about being tough, but he, for decades afterwards, would reflect on decisions. Did he ever speak of that day, say in the 90s, when he wrote confessionally?
Yes, he did, and we learned about other moments. I think acting at the advice of one of his daughters. McNamara had a son and two daughters, and one of them was a friend of an anti-war activist whose name I'm blanking on at the moment. Sorry.
Brown, I believe. Brown.
They invited this guy to the McNamara home for dinner. And McNamara and this fellow argued, but politely. And McNamara talked about his love of nature and his happy times climbing mountains. And afterwards, this guy, this activist, said, or as he was leaving, he said, "I can't believe that somebody who loves nature as much as you do takes the positions on the war that you do." So they had a civil and even respectful occasion. But McNamara felt that he shared the views of anti-war people, and the most dramatic example of that came when a Quaker burned himself to death outside of McNamara's window with McNamara watching. This man was holding his baby, but as he poured gasoline on himself and set himself afire, he handed the baby, thank God, to people who were nearby. But this occurred in the fall of 65, and it was one of the events that had a devastating effect on McNamara. He went home and he didn't dare talk about this with either his wife or his children. But he later said that he shared the views of the man who immolated himself right outside McNamara's window outside the Pentagon.
There's a photograph on the front of your book jacket. It's McNamara staring outside a window. I presume that's the offices of the secretary. It's a very narrow window. I
Yes.
believe he's looking at the demonstration in 1968 against the war. Did he reflect upon what he saw, what he was looking at? It's a picture that you can't read his face. He's just staring icily.
I think that picture on the cover of our book says uh, volumes about McNamara's attitude. Because on the one hand, he had mobilized the defense of the Pentagon against this massive demonstration. And he had brought out military men with guns, but told them not to fire. So,
87 airborne, I think. 87 combat troops.
yes, they were. And so, on the one hand, he's defending the Pentagon against these college students mainly who are moving on the Pentagon. But on the other hand, he says later, and listen to this, he says later, if I had been in charge of that demonstration, we would have blockaded the Pentagon, we would have shut it down. So here's this guy, on the one hand, defending the Pentagon against an anti war demonstration, and on the other hand, saying, if I had been in charge of that demonstration, we would have shut down the Pentagon. And I think here you see the clashing instincts of McNamara, proud that he has stopped the demonstration from shutting down the Pentagon, and yet saying, if I'd been in charge, we would have shut down the Pentagon. So he's proud both sides. He's proud of his anti-war sentiments, and he's proud of his prowess, which would have been used to shut down the Pentagon if only he had been in charge of the demonstration.
A question that can't be answered, but I'm going to ask it. Did Johnson fire him or did McNamara quit? Do we know? Can we tell?
McNamara claims that he didn't know, which is quite an admission that he didn't know whether he was fired or quit. But I think it was quite clear that Johnson fired him. Johnson, by that point, knew that McNamara had soured on the war, and that was one reason to fire him. But Johnson also preserved his affection for McNamara and worried about McNamara's health. He was afraid that McNamara was coming apart emotionally and wanted to get him out of there into a place where he'd be safer and where his health would be safeguarded.
After the Pentagon, there is the World Bank. He becomes president of the World Bank. He arrives very early in the morning, leaves late at night, travels the world, is repairing himself after years of struggle at the Pentagon. However, Professor, the World Bank at this point, what is its job? Because when he first takes over, he's surprised at how little it's doing, a very small portfolio.
Well, he's in charge, although he's in charge in part because he's appointed by the American president, which is the U.S. is the biggest contributor to the World Bank. But he has a council of people from all other countries who are contributing to the bank, and he sees that he wants to be individually running the bank. And the first thing he decides is it's giving too little money to the poorest of the poor. It's spending most of its money on infrastructure, dams, highways, things like that. And so he carries out a revolution at the World Bank in which they redirect much of their money to trying to help, as I say, and as he says, the poorest of the poor. One example of that is he becomes aware of river blindness, which is a terrible disease which in a certain part of Africa is transmitted by mosquitoes and other bugs and has the effect of blinding the poor peasants whom they bite. And he is taken to see the result, which is little boys leading 10 or 15 blind men along a riverbank because they can't see. And he decides that there ought to be a program to attack this. He institutes such a program. It has a major effect. And this is an example of McNamara doing the right thing, doing what he had originally thought of doing when he went to Harvard Business School. That is, combining whatever it is he does with serving the world. And he now sees himself as doing that. And in that sense, his stint at the World Bank is a kind of repentance, I think, for what he has done in Vietnam. And in Vietnam, he says to him, he says of himself afterwards, I killed tens of thousands of people, and I want to explain to them. I owe them an explanation. Uh,
I'm,
yes,
I'm glad you mentioned that, Professor, because I want to go back to that original conversation we had about LeMay. You flagged for me in your book that McNamara, in talking about his life story, only mentions the Pacific campaign briefly, doesn't give any detail. We have reason to believe he was on Guam March 9th, 1945, the firebombing of Tokyo, and called attention him not talking about this. Did he, in his interviews that he gave in the 80s and 90s, and he wrote about autobiography, I believe, in 95,
yes.
about his time, he didn't talk much about the Pacific. Did he talk about the bombing in Vietnam? Bombing was what tied those events together. Was that important to him, or was the confession more general than that?
No, he talked about the bombing because he had learned from his own study and the study of others that the bombing did not break Germany. It did not utterly break the morale of German civilians. This was the assumption. This was the conclusion. And he applied this to Vietnam. When the generals wanted to bomb North Vietnam, he went along with it. But when they wanted to bomb it more than he wanted, he resisted it. And he cited what he thought were the lessons of World War II. But I'm not sure he cited, in fact, I'm pretty sure he did not cite his own sense of guilt about the firebombing of Tokyo with a cost, with the death, producing the death of 100,000 people.
And Agent Orange, did he write about that? Did he confess about that
Yes,
too?
he did. He wrote about that, and he said he was not aware of what its effects would be. If he had known that it would be poisoning not only Vietnamese but American soldiers, he would not have allowed it.
Yes, I noted that he said that he wasn't well briefed or briefed at all about the toxicity of Agent Orange. I was surprised by that because that's his Pentagon. He he had a handle on everything, but not that detail. All right,
Well,
the
he
World
may
Bank.
have lied about that. He lied about a great deal.
Uh, the confessions. There were serial confessions because there would be interviews, there would be books, there would be pieces of books. It continued well into the 90s. And in the 21st century, he became more and more frail. The relationship with his children, however, was tattered, and it does not seem to have been repaired. Is that a fair
Well, his
conclusion?
children claim it was repaired. Craig McNamara, who wrote a book about his father in Vietnam called "Because Our Fathers Lied,"
Right.
uh, was deeply estranged from his father, but argues that at the very end they were reconciled. I don't think he was as deeply estranged from his two daughters. I had the sense, I got to know one of them quite well, that she was very fond of her father. She told me stories about how he broke away from the Pentagon to fly all the way out to California to help her with her studies because he knew she was having trouble. Uh, but you're right to say there were terrible times in his family life when his relationship, especially with his son, was fractured. And furthermore, McNamara felt that it was Vietnam that killed his wife. She died of cancer, but he was convinced that she had taken ill as a result of the stress that she felt about the war and its effect on their family.
McNamara at War, A New History. Philip Taubman, William Taubman. This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor.